Ross, what a day it was yesterday. Two classic games, especially with how that game ended last night with Texas on the cusp of a monster upset. Not upset because if they would have won, but how badly they were in trouble with time and distance and score. But it's over. And now we have Michigan and we have Washington next Monday for the national title.
Yeah, it's like the 90s all over again, where Michigan and Washington are both good at the same time. Who would have thought? But I thought both games were really good, although, I don't know if you really made the argument for the four best teams the way that some of the Michigan-Alabama game went because it was kind of sloppy. But it was good. Michigan was tough. Alabama did what they did all year. I was kind of surprised they didn't find a way to pull it out in the end because they won ugly every time. Penalties and stupid stuff and non-Saban-like Alabama team, but they always kind of found a way. But Michigan did a great job not letting Jalen Milroe improvise, which is what has kind of carried Alabama through the last part of the season, is that he just got so good at, all right, I'm going to go be an athlete, and they didn't let him do that. And then Washington overcame. Look, Kalen DeBoer was the AP Coach of the Year, and he certainly deserved that, although he almost had to give it back in the last minute last night because he kind of forgot what he was doing for a little bit there.
Yeah, glad to be back. What's up, chat? It's been a little while, but I feel like we all needed that break, and we're glad to have it, but are also glad to be here today and to have a national championship game to now look forward to, although it's bittersweet because that does mean the end of the college football season as a whole. So here we are, just one game to go, and what a game it should be with Washington and Michigan, and what a way to close out, bowl season unofficially yesterday with those semifinal games, and what classic finishes we had, for all the talk that you want to, put in there about how this part of the game or that part of the game might have gone. The endings were classics with the overtime there with the Tide and Wolverines, and then obviously Texas' attempt to sit there and win the game there at the end. Fun games to watch. I think, I'll disagree with Paul maybe slightly, although we didn't really flesh out his opinion too much. I think it was pretty clear the committee was probably smiling yesterday because you look at those games and you get those two types of games, and I feel like you could sit there and say, see, this is why we did what we did. We wanted the four best teams, whereas had it been a Florida State, are you getting a game like that? We'll never know. Obviously, Florida State and their showing didn't do much to really, sway people in their, direction as far as deserving, because there wasn't much to take away from that game other than that's not what Florida State was all year, and that was a shell of who they were. But it did open the door for the Georgia fans to clamor and say, see, we should have been in there. Mm-hmm. And I think if anything, it was a win for all parties except for maybe Florida State and Georgia, because the playoff committee got two classic games with a classic national championship game now on the docket, and you've got very much a battle of good versus evil in some ways with Washington versus Michigan, and you saw Florida State go out there and just completely flounder and not look that great. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of college football fans out there that say that Florida State still should have deserved a shot, and they might have not made the semifinals, but deserve a spot in a first-round type of game. Maybe you beat a Liberty or whoever it might be, and then there's an Oregon, and there's a Georgia who can sit there and say, in an expanded playoff, we could have done some damage. We could have made some noise, and we'll get to find that out next year with whoever ends up making that. But, yeah, it was a lot to unpack and a couple of great games.
One of the things, though, Florida State would have had their full allotment of players, maybe one or two who are not there. I would think that their offense would have been able to do as much with their full allotment of players with Rodemaker as far as the quarterback. Bottom line, we'll never know because everyone bolted. And, of course, that game with Georgia, Georgia had a chance. They could have ended Alabama's year. They could have possibly gotten Florida State in it. I don't know. But it's a lot of, well, what if? But the bottom line is we have evidence. We have two teams left, Michigan and also Washington, and both in different ways, but both in dramatic endings. And, Paul, you're going to do a Jordan Travis top five.
I kind of did this whole thing because I didn't want to get full into my tinfoil hat rant, but
yeah, because I think we need to focus on those who played in the
game,
and also who was in the championship game, and a few nuggets on that too.
But I do think that even sans Jordan Travis, that if Florida State's defense is at full strength, they could have hung with three of the four of the teams. I think Michael Penix would have provided a problem, and he will for everybody because he's just in his bag right now. Kalen DeBoer last night at the end of that game, though, that's the thing that sticks out to me. Now, I think an argument can be made that maybe the reason he's the coach of the year is that he's coached the team well enough to know that if I, forget what I'm doing for 90 seconds here, all you got to do is make one play. And that's all they did at the end. 1 second left. They had to make a play. They made the play and they won the game. But the way that Washington approached the last minute of that game was
the last minute 45. Yeah.
It was the last minute 45 was awful. I mean, it was just awful. And so to hang on and win it just kind of shows how they do it, and they've done it all year. It's 10 games in a row where they just kind of play this way and find a way to win because you have one of the best quarterbacks, two best quarterbacks in the country in Michael Penix, and then you've got Roma Dunze, and not to mention the other two guys, but when it comes down to it, when they need a big play or they need something demonstrative, it's just Penix to a Dunze, and it just pops the other team's balloon so much that what can you do about it?
Here's the bottom line. Why were they running the ball at the end with Dylan Johnson? And somebody just mentioned, Kalen DeBoer couldn't have predicted the player getting hurt. He had already been hurt. He was already injured. Dylan Johnson was injured. That's why you wonder about taking the knee. That injury probably cost somewhere between 25 and 40 seconds. It allowed Texas, and then, of course, the pass or punt catch interference, another 15 yards. It put them in a position where they didn't have to risk that. Yes, if he picks up the first down, but they weren't going to get him more than a couple of yards with Johnson against that Texas front because they hadn't gotten many yards rushing other than a Penix kind of a zone read. But what a near disaster, and Texas was nearly in the championship game, but Penix was brilliant throughout the night.
Yeah, I mean, that was a fantastic way to cap off bowl season. That was just an awesome game all the way around, really fun throughout, even though there was times where Washington seemed to be pretty well in control and then obviously not enough to avoid the near catastrophe there at the end. I think if you're a Washington fan, that you're just very relieved and also not only excited about next week, but very relieved that you're standing around the water cooler after Christmas break and you're not talking about one of the great collapses in playoff history or one of the worst defeats in your school's history, because that would have been right up there. Instead, you're talking about mistakes that were made that were overcame or that you dodged, and you can't help Dylan Johnson getting hurt. And he had a couple runs here and there that got nice yardage, but never broke free, obviously. But yeah, you can't. That's not DeBoer's fault that he gets hurt. But I understand that now we can kind of look back and say, well, had they done this, had they kneeled it, they could have ran time off. And luckily again for them, that's a mistake they get to learn from, but they're not hurt from. So be thankful for that. But what a game for Michael Penix. I think when you look at hindsight about, well, who should have been in the playoff? Should it have been different than the 4 that we got? Or who should have been this or been that? Who should have been the Heisman Trophy winner? I think there's a long conversation, with the benefit of hindsight that you can have about Michael Penix and how deserving he may or may not have been for that award, or how deserving he should have been for that award. And he got mentions, but I did find it odd, and we talked about it, why is Bo Nix getting more Heisman attention than Michael Penix at one stage, even after Washington had beaten them the first time? And why is this guy, why is that guy why is Jaden Daniels just without a doubt the Heisman Trophy winner, and Michael Penix just seemed to sort of fade? And I get some of that's the performance, some of that's numbers in certain games and whatnot, but man, he showed last night that he is among the best players in college football, if there was any doubt. I don't think there was much, and he should have probably gotten even more consideration than he did in the general discussion about the Heisman Trophy. He was sensational, and he's been doing that kind of thing throughout the year, off and on, as far as tremendous performances. But last night was certainly up there amongst his best showings. And Dunze, incredible player. He's going to be great in the pros.
Yep.
McMillan and Polk, especially coming off the being kind of banged up these last couple of games, to burst out and have the real big catch early on that nearly took it the distance, I thought was huge for Washington. So, yeah, I mean, their receivers and their quarterback, going in, that was the one area for Texas that you didn't really have that concrete answer of oh, yeah, we got this. We can check that box. You felt pretty good, I think, but your one major worry was how is the secondary going to hold up against those receivers and against Michael Penix? And unfortunately for Texas, that one glaring weakness was the glaring weakness in that game, and that's how Washington was able to ultimately get out in front and then hold on to win.
Here's a note about the Washington receivers, because I know there was a lot of discussion. Penix mentioned the Texas defense during the week leading up and mentioned that they're not like the 49ers or the Eagles or whatever. There's no doubt Texas's front four, especially with Murphy and obviously Tavondre Sweat, they still didn't do much, although Penix was really good on the zone read and probably could have taken it and gone many other times and scored walking into the end zone. But here's a couple of stats. The Washington receivers, Odunze, Polk, McMillan, and Bernard, who did have a terrible muff punt, were targeted 20 times last night. They caught 19 passes for 353 yards and 2 touchdowns. You cannot be more perfect, if in fact, unless it would have been 20 catches for 300 whatever yards. That means they were running free, but they also some dimes that Penix threw into and that doesn't include what he did with the tight end.
Well, look, I think that there was like Ryan Watts was getting turned around by Rome Odunze, but sometimes I went back and was watching, and I think if Ryan Watts goes back and looks at the film, he's going to go, well, what am I supposed to do? Like I did everything I was coached to do, and this dude's just that guy. I mean, sometimes you run up against Superman, and that's Rome Odunze is that good, and then you've got other guys. If Rome Odunze wasn't there, they have enough guys to make plays without him. He's just that much better, and he and Penix have such an unbelievable chemistry, and they have this knack for knowing the moment really well. This is okay. We didn't get it the last time, but we need to get it this time.
The throw down the sideline that led to their last field goal was absolutely just incredible because, as Craig, you mentioned, Watts was right where he was supposed to be.
Yeah, Dunze, another guy, if you want to go look hindsight, we're talking about, well, Penix maybe with the Heisman should have gotten a couple more votes. So how about the Blitnikoff and Roma Dunze? I know some people who voted for him. And I don't know. I would have had a hard time not voting for him, although Marvin Harrison Jr. is obviously a great player. But, yeah, Rome Odunze showed the country who maybe didn't know, I think most people did, of why he is just such a spectacular player. And just that whole wide receiving core is pretty special there for Washington. So is the quarterback, and he's got a great story. And, it wasn't just them, though. I mean, that defense made some plays when they needed to. It would have been interesting to see Texas early on able to run the ball really effectively, and then they got behind, and then they weren't able to really just, go to the run as often as they probably would have liked to have done. I don't know. That would have been just curious to see how that game would have played out had they not found themselves in a little bit of a hole, feeling like they had to pass it a little bit more, how Washington's defense would have held up against that. But I think that they played pretty well, and that offensive line for Washington deserves a massive amount of credit as well. So much talk about matchups, and I mentioned the Texas secondary, but how about all of the talk about the Texas D-line and how dominant they've been and how great they've been, and then, the Washington O-line pretty good too, and they even had some comments going into that game, right, of trying to get some little trash talk bulletin board material where the Texas D-line caught wind of, some Washington offensive linemen talking about, well, hey, we're pretty good, and, this and that, and man, I didn't hear Murphy's name much last night. I didn't hear Sweat's name much last night. I know they weren't always in on every play, but that was a pretty spectacular effort as well from the Washington Huskies offensive line.
Here's a note that discussed what you just discussed, that both Devondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, both of them are incredible players. There's no doubt about that. They had 6 pressures of Michael Penix. Now, there was one where Murphy looked like he had Penix dead to right. He stepped up in the pocket and threw a dart. But they had 6 pressures. The defensive player of the game last night, besides the ball being swatted away at the end, was Trice. He was everywhere. But one of the things leading up to the last 3 or 4 games that I noticed with Texas players, especially Murphy, he'd put like that little symbol of time and date and where they're going to play a game, and he backed it up. He did that again last week. I think it was with an offensive lineman or with Penix
during a media session or something.
And in this particular case, Washington came in confident. Texas came in confident, went down to the wire. But Sweat and Murphy, who did a good job against the run, did not put pressure. None of them did against Penix throughout most of the night last night.
No, and, Washington, I mean, they might be a team of destiny because every, weird call that could have gone against them didn't last night. I mean, Michael Penix threw a ball well across the line of scrimmage, except for apparently his right shoulder and ass cheek, and they didn't.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah, well, so it wasn't a penalty, even though, man, it sure looked like one.
It was like everything, like his elbow of his throwing arm and beyond was behind the line, but everything else was in front of the line.
Yeah.
So he was just very lucky there.
Yeah, he was super lucky there.
And the ruling is, as long as any part of your body is behind the line of scrimmage, even if both feet are across, then it's still behind the line of scrimmage, which I'm not sure I agree with that, but
no,
that was an interesting play.
But I always I remember thinking when you're in when they don't have replay, usually if you step your foot across, in high school or whatever, then it's beyond the line of scrimmage because they don't have any other way to know unless they're standing right on it. But But then they had a block in the back that could have been called at a certain time that wasn't called, and it was very obvious.
Yeah, it was right
They
in front of the Texas bench. That was a little bit strange.
They had it was just all these weird things that went against them, and then to. Texas's other problem last night was they had a lot of little paper cut things, false starts and offsides.
Well, they had the turnover.
Fumbles.
Washington had the muff, and then they've turned it over twice with the running back pack. But what am I thinking about? The running back from Florida that's their 5-star kid.
Baxter.
And then, Baxter, and then also Kane had Blue. Blue had a turnover, and the officials saying he was down, and he was running with the ball bobbling. But it was an incredible game. Ewers was pretty much non-existent, as was Worthy and Mitchell till the end. And when that game kind of opened up, and you could see they had an opportunity, they started forcing the ball down the field a little bit. But in the end, we have Washington and we have Michigan.
Yeah, it was an incredible, fun atmosphere there in the Sugar Bowl last night. Made me think of when we were there about 3 years ago and just what that atmosphere can be like when it's packed out and New Orleans is buzzing with the Sugar Bowl and all of that. And I can only imagine with those two fan bases and there being a playoff atmosphere in addition to just the regular Sugar Bowl activity, just how fun that scene must have been. But I'm just so thankful that the semifinals lived up to all the hype. Is all the consternation, all of the discussion, all of the anger in some cases. Those two games were legit, and we're going to have what looks like a pretty legit national championship as well. And, hey, kudos to Texas. Had a tremendous season. I think if you're Brett Yormark, you're smiling. You got the payout for the playoff, but you don't have to sit there and then worry about them leaving with the national championship trophy in tow, although I'd be interested to hear his thoughts in totality about just the whole Texas exit and their success at the end. But, that was their last ride, and now it's off to the SEC, and I think they've got a lot of great things to build off of, a lot of exciting things in store. But certainly getting to that point is easier said than done. And even with the expanded playoff, you're going to be a playoff team easier than you would have been in previous years. That goes for just about every program. But that four in the way that it is, it'll never be like that probably ever again. You were able to get there in that last year with a really special team, and I know you've got to feel like, as great of a game as that was, like, man, we blew an opportunity there, right? And I'm sure that Alabama feels the exact same way of like, man, we had an opportunity. I bet they wish they had that play call back to Jalen Milroe on the keeper to end the game.
Or they had a better snap.
Or
like
better
throughout
snap,
the game, which was a problem.
So, you lose in those games yesterday. You're gonna have things that you question, but, hats off to Steve Sarkisian. I'm not a Texas fan, but I am a fan of his. I think he's a really great coach. I do think there was some play calling there at the end. There was, feels like almost like nerves got the best of them maybe in some cases. But it was a terrific team, and they're going to be hard-pressed to sit there and just run it back because that's a really good bunch of guys, and they're going to lose some talent to the NFL. But, that goes for all the semifinal teams. But, hats off to Texas, hats off to Alabama, and can't wait to see Michigan and Washington.
We will get a little bit later.